Love was never meant to be a battlefield. But for Margaret Vale, love had always been about rules about duty, reputation, and obedience. Raised in a powerful and highly respected family, her life was carefully planned long before she could even understand what freedom meant. Every choice she made carried the weight of her family's name. And then she met Yvonne Blake. Yvonne was everything Margaret was taught to avoid: fearless, outspoken, and unapologetically real. She believed love should never be hidden, never controlled, and never sacrificed for society's approval. Where Margaret followed rules, Yvonne questioned them. Where Margaret built walls, Yvonne broke them. Their worlds were never supposed to meet. Margaret was promised to a future chosen by her family. Yvonne belonged to a life that rejected everything Margaret represented. Their love was not just forbidden, it was dangerous. Yet some hearts refused to obey. What begins as silent glances slowly grows into something deeper, a connection that challenges fear, tradition, and identity itself. But loving someone you are not allowed to love comes with a price. This is not just a story about romance. It is a story about courage, the courage to choose your own happiness. It is a story about truth that love cannot be forced nor controlled. And most importantly, it is a story about learning that sometimes the hardest battle in life is choosing between who you are and who the world wants you to be. Because in the end, love teaches us one powerful lesson. Freedom is meaningless if the heart remains imprisoned. Margaret Vale's life was perfect. At least that was what everyone believed. She lived in a grand mansion surrounded by tall iron gates, attended elegant gatherings, and carried herself with the grace expected from someone born into power. Every morning followed the same routine breakfast with her parents, work at the family foundation, social meetings in the evening. Everything was organized. Everything was controlled. Everything was decided for her, even her future. Your engagement to Adrian Quinn will be announced next month, her mother said one evening at dinner, her voice calm but final. Margaret's hand tightened around her fork. Adrian was kind, respectable, and approved by her family, the perfect match. But when she imagined a life beside him, she felt nothing but silence in her chest. No excitement, no warmth, no love. She forced a polite smile. If that is what the family wishes. That was the problem. Margaret had spent her entire life becoming what others wished. One afternoon, seeking escape from the suffocating expectations, Margaret volunteered to personally inspect a small community center funded by their foundation, something she rarely did herself. It was far from her world of luxury, hidden in a quiet part of the city where life was raw and honest. That was where she first saw Yvonne Blake. Yvonne stood in the middle of a room full of children, laughing freely as she helped them paint a mural on the wall. Her hands were stained with color, her hair loosely tied, her smile unguarded. She moved without fear of judgment, speaking with confidence and warmth. She looked alive. Margaret found herself staring longer than she intended. Yvonne noticed and walked toward her, wiping paint from her hands. "You must be from the foundation," Yvonne said casually, studying Margaret's elegant posture and formal attire. "You look like someone who's never touched paint in her life." Margaret blinked, surprised by the directness. People usually spoke to her with careful politeness. "I am Margaret Vale," she replied, maintaining composure. "I oversee this project." Yvonne raised an eyebrow. So you're the one funding this place? There was no awe in her voice. No fear, only curiosity. Margaret felt something unfamiliar, a strange mixture of discomfort and intrigue. And you are? Margaret asked. Yvonne Blake, she answered simply. I help people who don't get the same chances others do. Her words were gentle, yet Margaret sensed an unspoken challenge within them. For the first time in years, someone was not impressed by her name. Days passed, but Margaret could not forget their meeting. She found reasons to return to the community center, checking reports, reviewing progress, observing programs. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She wanted to see Yvonne again. With each encounter, Yvonne spoke freely about freedom, about choosing one's own path, about living honestly despite society's expectations. Her words stirred questions Margaret had buried for years. Do you ever choose something just because you want it? Yvonne asked her one day. Margaret hesitated. She had no answer. What Margaret did not realize was that the first crack in her carefully built world had already begun. She had spent her life living inside a cage made of duty and fear. And Yvonne Blake had just found the key. But freedom always comes with consequences. And soon, Margaret would learn that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Rumors began quietly. Margaret's frequent visits to the community center reached her family's ears. Her mother, Margaret Vale, did not approve. You are spending too much time in places beneath your standing, Eleanor warned coldly. You must focus on your engagement with Adrian. Margaret nodded obediently. But inside, resistance was growing. Days later, Margaret found Yvonne on the rooftop of the community center, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It's beautiful, Margaret whispered as she approached. Yvonne glanced at her. Beauty exists everywhere. People just choose not to see it. They stood side by side, the distance between them shrinking naturally. Why do you always look so sad? Yvonne asked suddenly. Margaret froze. No one had ever asked her that. I am not sad, she replied automatically. Yvonne gently shook her head. You are. You just learned how to hide it. Those words broke something inside Margaret. Years of silence, years of obedience, years of pretending. Without realizing it, she spoke honestly. I have never lived for myself. The confession trembled in the air. Yvonne reached for her hand slowly, carefully, giving Margaret time to pull away. Margaret did not. The simple touch sent warmth rushing through her body, a feeling both comforting and terrifying. Their hands fit naturally, as if they had always belonged together. In that moment, Margaret understood. Her heart was choosing something her world would never allow. But love born in secrecy grows in danger. Across the street, a familiar figure watched them from a distance. Adrian Quinn, Margaret's future fiancé. His expression hardened as he witnessed their closeness. The secret was no longer safe, and forbidden love, once discovered, rarely ends without pain. The change in Margaret did not go unnoticed. She became distant at home, quieter during family gatherings, and distracted whenever Adrian Quinn visited. The once obedient daughter was slowly slipping beyond her family's control. One evening, Adrian confronted her. I saw you, he said calmly, though his eyes revealed something darker. At the community center, with her. Margaret's breath caught. With who? Yvonne Blake. Silence filled the room. "You are mistaken," Margaret replied, forcing composure. But Adrian stepped closer. "You were holding her hand." The truth stood between them, undeniable. "I don't understand what's happening to you," Adrian continued. "But whatever this is, it must end. Our engagement will proceed as planned. Not our choice, a plan." Margaret felt the familiar weight of duty pressing against her chest, suffocating her. For years she would have obeyed without question. But now something inside her resisted. "I cannot promise that," she whispered. Adrian's expression hardened. "You will regret defying your family." The consequences came quickly. Margaret's parents restricted her movements, limiting her work outside the family foundation. Her visits to the community center were suddenly unnecessary. Her future was being tightened around her like chains. But love does not disappear because it is forbidden. It only grows stronger. Meanwhile, Yvonne sensed the distance. When Margaret finally returned after days of absence, Yvonne confronted her directly. "They're controlling you, aren't they?" Yvonne asked. Margaret could not deny it. "My life has never been my own," she admitted. Yvonne's voice softened. "Then choose it now." "Choose what?" "Choose yourself. Choose your happiness." Margaret's heart trembled. But choosing happiness meant risking everything: her family, her name, her security, the life she had always known. And she was not yet ready to lose it all. The distance between them, though small in space, suddenly felt impossible. The tension between duty and desire slowly tore Margaret apart. At home, preparations for her engagement announcement continued. Elegant gowns were chosen, invitations prepared. Futures decided all without her consent. To everyone else, she was living a dream. Inside, she was breaking. One night, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, Margaret secretly met Yvonne by the quiet riverside near the community center. The city lights reflected on the water as silence surrounded them. "I am afraid," Margaret confessed. "Of what?" Yvonne asked gently. "Of losing everything." Yvonne looked at her with painful honesty. "Sometimes you have to lose what was never truly yours to find what is." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "What if I choose you, and the world rejects me?" Yvonne stepped closer. "Then we face the world together." The sincerity in her voice shook Margaret's heart. For the first time, she saw a future built not on expectations, but on truth. Slowly, carefully, Yvonne reached for Margaret's face. Their first kiss was soft, hesitant, trembling with fear and longing. It was not perfect, it was not planned, but it was real. And in that moment, Margaret felt more alive than she ever had. Yet forbidden happiness never remains hidden for long. From the shadows, Eleanor Vale watched the scene unfold, her expression cold, her disappointment absolute. Margaret's secret was fully exposed. A storm was coming, and the price of loving Yvonne Blake would soon demand more than Margaret was prepared to give. Margaret was summoned to the main hall the next morning. Her parents stood waiting, their expressions cold and unforgiving. Beside them was Adrian Quinn, silent but watchful. The atmosphere was heavy, not of concern, but of judgment. Eleanor Vale spoke first. "You have brought disgrace to this family." Margaret remained still, though her hands trembled slightly. What you are doing is unnatural, unacceptable, and shameful, her mother continued. Your association with that woman ends today. That woman, not even Yvonne's name deserved recognition. Margaret gathered her courage. I love her. The confession echoed like thunder in the room. Her father's face darkened. Love is irrelevant. Duty comes first. For once, Margaret said, her voice shaking but firm. I want to live honestly. Her mother's eyes hardened. If you continue this relationship, you will lose everything, your inheritance, your position, your family. The ultimatum was clear. Choose them, or choose Ivonne. That night, Margaret sat alone in her room, staring at the life she had always known. The luxurious surroundings, the security, the comfort. Everything could disappear. But for the first time, she realized something painful. A comfortable cage was still a cage. Meanwhile, Yvonne faced her own struggles. She understood the danger Margaret was in and the power of the Vale family. She knew loving Margaret meant exposing her to conflict, rejection, and suffering. So when Margaret came to see her, desperate and afraid, Yvonne did something unexpected. You should go back to your family, Yvonne said quietly. Margaret looked at her in shock. You're asking me to leave you? I'm asking you to protect yourself. Yvonne's voice trembled despite her attempt to remain strong. Love should not destroy your life. But Margaret saw the pain hidden behind her words. And what about your life without me? Margaret asked. Yvonne had no answer, because sometimes loving someone also means letting them go, and that truth hurt more than anything. Days passed in painful silence. Margaret withdrew from Yvonne, trapped between fear and longing. She tried to convince herself that choosing her family was the right decision, the safe decision, but safety did not bring peace. Her laughter disappeared. Her smile faded. Her heart grew heavier each day. She was surviving, not living. The engagement announcement approached quickly. On the night of the grand celebration, Margaret stood before a mirror wearing an elegant white gown. She looked beautiful, but her eyes were empty. Her mother entered the room. This is the correct path, Eleanor said. You will thank us one day. Margaret stared at her reflection. For years she had obeyed. For years she had remained silent. But love had taught her something powerful. A life without truth is not life at all. As guests gathered downstairs and the announcement was about to begin, Margaret made her decision. She removed the engagement ring. Then she walked away from the expectations, away from the fear, away from the life chosen for her. She ran through the city until she reached the community center. Breathless and trembling, Yvonne stood there, shocked to see her. I choose you, Margaret said, tears falling freely. Not because it is easy, but because it is true. Yvonne's eyes filled with emotion. But their reunion was not a happy ending. It was only the beginning of a much greater struggle, a world that would challenge their love, test their courage, and force them to fight for the life they chose together. Because choosing love is one thing, fighting for it is another. Margaret's choice spread quickly. The powerful Vale family publicly announced that she had been disowned. Her name was removed from the family foundation, her access to wealth and status taken away overnight. The life she once lived disappeared as if it had never existed. Society followed. Whispers turned into judgment. Friends turned into strangers. Doors once open were now closed. For the first time in her life, Margaret experienced rejection not because of failure, but because of love. Life with Ivonne was simple. They lived in a small apartment near the community center. There were no servants, no luxury, no grand halls, only quiet mornings, shared meals, and honest laughter. Margaret struggled at first. She was not used to hardship, nor to living without certainty. But Yvonne patiently taught her everything: how to live freely, how to find joy in simplicity, how to stand without fear. And for a while they were happy, truly happy. But happiness born from sacrifice carries hidden burdens. Margaret began noticing the difficulties her presence brought to Yvonne's life. Donations to the community center decreased because of her connection to the scandal. Some volunteers left. Opportunities disappeared. Yvonne never complained, but Margaret saw the exhaustion in her eyes. "Are you unhappy?" Yvonne asked one night. Margaret forced a smile. "No." But inside, guilt slowly consumed her. Had her love destroyed Yvonne's world the same way she had lost her own? The pressure grew heavier when Margaret's father fell seriously ill. Her mother sent a message not of forgiveness, but of condition. Return home, end the relationship, restore the family's honor. Margaret's heart broke. Her family was still her blood, her past, her history. The people who raised her, but choosing them meant losing Yvonne forever. Once again, she stood at the crossroads between duty and love. Margaret made a decision, one she believed was an act of love. Without telling Yvonne, she went back to her family. She convinced herself it was the right choice. If she returned, her family would regain their reputation. The community center would recover support. Yvonne's life would be easier. Sometimes people mistake sacrifice for love. When Yvonne discovered Margaret's disappearance, the truth shattered her. Margaret had chosen her family. The silence Margaret left behind hurt more than rejection itself. Yvonne felt betrayed not because Margaret returned home, but because she left without trust, without honesty, without goodbye. Love built on courage had been broken by fear. At the Vale mansion, Margaret lived once again in luxury, but nothing felt the same. The grand halls felt colder. The comfort felt empty. The silence was unbearable. She had regained everything she once possessed, except the one thing that made her feel alive. One night, standing alone in her room, Margaret finally understood the lesson love had been trying to teach her. Love is not proven by sacrifice alone. It is proven by honesty, trust, and the courage to stay. And she had failed. Meanwhile, Yvonne continued her work at the community center. But the light within her had dimmed. She learned another painful truth. Loving someone means accepting that they may choose a life without you, but destiny is not finished with them. Months later, Margaret publicly rejected her family's control in a bold declaration, exposing the truth about her forced choices and standing openly for her identity. She walked away from everything, not for comfort, not for security, but for truth. And this time, she returned to Yvonne not as a frightened woman, but as someone finally free. Whether Yvonne would accept her again remained uncertain. Because forgiveness, like love, must be freely given. Margaret stood once again at the doors of the community center. Her heart pounded with fear not of rejection, but of facing the consequences of her past choices. This time she had no family name to protect her, no wealth to shield her, no certainty waiting ahead. She had only truth and love. Yvonne saw her from across the room. Time seemed to freeze between the memories of laughter, pain, betrayal, and longing filling the silence. The distance between them was no longer measured by steps, but by trust that had once been broken. Margaret walked closer, her voice trembling. "I did not come back because I need you," she said honestly. "I came back because I finally understand who I am, and I want to share my life with you, if you still allow me." Tears filled her eyes. "I was afraid before. I chose fear instead of love. I chose silence instead of honesty. But I will never choose a life without truth again." She did not beg. She did not demand. She simply waited. Because real love respects freedom, even the freedom to walk away. Yvonne's heart ached as she looked at the woman she once loved, and still loved. Forgiveness was not easy. The pain had been real. The abandonment had been real. But so was Margaret's courage to return without pride, without status, without anything except sincerity. Slowly, Yvonne stepped forward. "Love is not about never making mistakes," Yvonne said softly. "It is about choosing each other." Again and again, she reached for Margaret's hand, and this time, Margaret held on without fear. Their life together was not perfect. Society still judged them. The world remained harsh. Challenges continued. But they faced everything side by side, not as prisoner and rescuer, not as sacrifice and duty, but as equals who chose truth over comfort. Margaret learned to live freely. Yvonne learned to trust again. And together, they built a life defined not by society's rules, but by their own courage. Their story became more than a forbidden romance. It became a reminder that love cannot be controlled by fear or tradition. True happiness requires courage and honesty. Freedom begins when we accept who we truly are. And the greatest act of love is choosing truth, even when it costs everything. Because in the end, the strongest love is not the one that is easy. It is the one brave enough to be free.